What is up, you guys? Hope you're having an awesome day. I'm your host Ayman Hassan and welcome back to another video. Now, since we are in the middle of self-quarantining and isolation, I feel like this video will just not provide any solace to us whatsoever. I know some friends who are thriving at home, being productive and just straight up loving it, and I have other friends who are literally going crazy and are about to pull their hair out. I get it, I really do. Isolation can drive people to do extreme things, so let's just get straight into it. These are the top 10 scary things people have done in isolation. Starting us off at number 10 is agoraphobia. A man named Frank De Palm spent 22 years in solitary confinement, and that resulted in him going into panic mode when entering any place that was larger than his cell. He started his confinement on February 3rd, 1992 after he tried to strangle one of the prison guards. He revealed that during the last 5 years of his confinement, he didn't step foot out of his cell once, which caused him to develop a syndrome called agoraphobia. It's basically the opposite of claustrophobia, and rather than a small space making you feel anxious or overwhelmed, an open large space makes you feel that way instead. It can get so bad to the point people will just not leave their house to avoid having panic attacks. He said he refused to leave his cell after that, and it caused him to live within his own fantasies and create imaginary friends and relationships in his head. He got so deep into it that the memories from his real life started to disappear, and he couldn't quite decipher what was real and what was not. Coming in at number 9 is the 16-year-old. When most people think back to themselves at 16, it usually involves things like school, homework, and some person that they were in love with that they thought they'd marry but then they didn't, woohoo. However, this teenager was so isolated from reality that he became a murderer. Mentally, he was isolated from the rest of his classmates, and his home life had him spending his free time in isolation as well. In 1997, the boy kidnapped a Japanese tourist named Michiko Okiyuma, who was just 22 years old at the time. He held her captive in isolation with him and slammed her dead against a wall until she drowned in her own blood inside a soundproof vault in an empty warehouse. Just drowning in your own blood, I don't even know what to say about that. It seemed that the isolation made him go even more stir crazy, and he decided to put her body in a wheelbarrow and walk her dead body through the city streets before dumping it near a school. I can't even imagine how scared she would have been. At number 8, we have the Chicago TYLENOL murders, which I have spoken about in another video. Back in September of 1982, a 12-year-old girl in Chicago passed away shortly after taking an extra-strength Tylenol. That same day, a man died in a nearby hospital after taking the same pill. Over the course of the next few weeks, people were dropping dead left, right, and center after taking Tylenol, and after investigation, they realized the medication had been laced with potassium cyanide. Turns out there was a man named James Lewis who was suspected to be behind the murders. He was a man who isolated himself from the rest of the world, and once the news was made public, he contacted the company Johnson & Johnson and admitted he had been tampering with the bottles. He admitted to it and also demanded $1 million in exchange for him to stop doing so. James, there are surely other things you could be doing in isolation. Not killing people. That's not the way. Filling at number 7 slot is the Girl Scout killer. Back in the summer of 1977, 3 young Girl Scouts were staying at an Oklahoma campsite when they were brutally raped and murdered. All of the girls were between the ages of 8 and 10, but what made things even more disturbing was that 2 months prior, a camp counselor found a disturbing note in her belongings. The serial killer had left a note promising to murder 3 children at the camp, but the counselor just thought it was a prank that one of the kids had written as a joke and never said anything. She probably feels stupid now. The prime suspect was a man named Gene Leroy Hart, who spent years in isolation locked behind prison bars. He was already in prison for other charges of rape, but the struggle with isolation drove him to escape and commit his crimes all over again. Now at number 6 is Cannibal Lecter. Did you like that one? Thanks. Did come up with it myself. Now this is an extreme case of isolation blues. Back in 1986, a man named Issei Sagawa was isolated in a Japanese mental institution and signed himself out because he just couldn't handle it anymore. He came from a pretty wealthy family and had a good home environment, so it was very hard for people to understand why he turned into a cannibal by the age of 23. Turns out as a kid he spent most of his time alone and engaged in cannibalistic urges, which then led him to his first attempt when he broke into a woman's home and cut off some of her flesh and ate it. He was caught and then charged with attempted rape, which I mean, wrong crime, but okay. Later on down the road, he moved to France where he ended up earning a PhD in literature. But while studying, he isolated himself even further with his twisted thoughts and ended up killing and eating his classmate, a girl named Renee Harteveld. That's when he was finally put back in a mental institution, but the confinement and isolation just made him go even more crazy. That boy should have never left. He should have stayed in the first one that he was in. Coming in at number 5 5 is the granny killer. Man, what did the elderly do to you? They're just innocently just knitting and smelling like baby powder, just going about their little lives, waddling about. Either way, an Australian man named John Wayne Glover was living alone and rarely spoke to anyone from the outside world. It seemed like the isolation got to his head and he only spoke to the women who happened to walk by his house once in a while. And coincidentally, these elderly women were his victims who he brutally attacked, killing 6 of them. He would use household objects as his murder weapons since he never left his home, and this included things like hammers, kitchen utensils, and even the victim's own pantyhose. At his trial, a psychologist noted that while he was sane, he did suffer from personality disorder, which he seemed to develop from his past home life and only spending time with himself inside the same 4 walls every single day. At number 4 is the prisoner. Honestly, it's really not out of the realm of possibility to think that someone isolated in a prison cell would slowly lose their insanity and act out. But this one is a bit of a rare case because this man was isolated, went insane just to get even more isolated. James Robertson was serving his sentence when he murdered his own cellmate. He did it because he had been in jail since he was 16 years old and wanted to be transferred over to death row. Apparently death row has some perks like nicer bathroom facilities, better food, and since he was going to be in jail for the rest of his life, he thought he may as well just get it over and done with. For someone to wish themselves a death sentence is pretty insane, but it just goes to show how utterly brutal isolation really is. Some people would rather die than be alone. Ain't that the truth? Filling at number 3 slot is hospital isolation. Now we've talked about what it might be like to be isolated in a prison cell, but many people are admitted to hospitals and can also feel incredibly restricted if kept there for a long period of time, and a lot of people are. One patient couldn't handle the feeling of being isolated in a hospital room any longer, and he ended up beating his nurse to death. 40-year-old Quincy Jones was charged with attempted murder and assault after beating a 70-year-old nurse named Evelyn Lynch to death. She was removing a catheter from his body when he knocked her to the floor and beat her until she was unconscious. She was admitted to the hospital in critical condition and later died as a result of her injuries. As for the patient, he was charged and faced even worse isolation, that being behind bars. I get you're frustrated with isolation, but what does the nurse have anything to do with that? She's literally trying to make you feel better so you can be discharged. She's like the one person trying to help you. Now at number 2 is the El Paso shooting. There's been a big debate on whether social rejection and isolation can fuel violence, and the shooter from this case claims that it definitely does. In 2019, a man shot up a Walmart store in Texas, killing 22 people and injuring dozens. I actually mentioned him in my Scary People Seen at Walmart series if you want a more in-depth version of the story. Either way, he claimed that he was an extreme loner who always got picked on and was isolated from all of his fellow classmates. The 21-year-old shooter named Patrick Crusius said his lonely life in isolation is what fueled his anger and led him to become violent. Because of all the mass shootings we've seen in the past decade, a study was done that found over 3/4 of mass shooters are bullied and isolated from the people around them. It's been said that social rejection can lead to a very dark and dangerous form of isolation. So, as Ellen would say, be kind to one another. And finally, at number 1 is the coronavirus isolation. The majority of us are currently in quarantine or self-isolation due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Some people might enjoy the isolation at home while others struggle and don't really know how to handle it. The isolation has led some people to take their own lives, and that honestly breaks my heart. An Indian man was suspected of being infected with the virus and ended up committing suicide by jumping off the 7th floor of Safdarjung Hospital. He'd been admitted to the hospital by airport authorities and was being quarantined for safety precautions because he had just returned from Australia and had some of the symptoms. Because of this, he was immediately put in the isolation ward and it drove him insane. He forced open the isolation ward doors and jumped off the building. And that is it for today's video, guys. A bit morbid, I know, given our current circumstances. I hope this video has made you realize isolation, yes, it's bad, but it can be worse. Please treat yourselves well, treat your mental health well, reach out to people, Skype, have Skype parties, FaceTime parties, stay connected, people. As always, I'm your host Ayman Hassan, and I'll catch you in the next one. Bye! I don't have coronavirus. There's a chip that was stuck in my throat. What's this chip? I only had one! I was trying to flick this off and then I realized it was a freckle. That's on there. That's on there. It's staying on there.